Today is the 5th Sunday of our sermon series, Women in the Bible, and we will be uncovering the story of Phoebe from the letter of Romans. In just 2 verses, Paul describes Phoebe and her role in the early church. Listen as Paul shines a light on her significance. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. I first met Phoebe 4 years ago in a small town Baptist church in East Texas, when my senior pastor placed a Christianity Today article on my desk titled, Paul's most beloved letter was entrusted to a woman. If you haven't heard of Phoebe, you're not alone. Many biblical scholars joke that most people are so worn out by the time they get through the first half of Romans, they often close the book and take a nap. What makes Romans even more challenging is the way we've been taught to read it. While arguably the most famous of Paul's letters over time, the book of Romans has been interpreted and taught not as a letter from pastor to congregation, but as systematic theology, a bullet point list of religious truths. Many evangelical traditions use Romans as a tool of evangelism. Romans Road is a series of individual verses which walk people through a system of steps to understand their sin and need of salvation. Over time, the letter of Romans has become divorced from the pastoral and used more as a personal pamphlet. Instead of reading Romans like theological bullet points or a tool for quick conversions, teacher and scholar Scott McKnight encourages reading Romans backwards. He teaches that in order for us to understand Romans as Paul intended, we must flip to the end of the letter, to chapters 12 through 16. Here we discover Romans as a pastoral letter to a particular people in a particular place. Most importantly, if we never get to the end of the letter, we never meet Phoebe. A couple of years after I read the article about Phoebe, my husband Aaron and I found out we were having another baby girl. I knew immediately I wanted to name her Phoebe. When I shared the name with our family, they reacted in the same way I had the first time I discovered her. How come we have never heard of Phoebe? Sadly, the honest answer to this question is, our churches have overlooked her. We have not seen Phoebe because of centuries of discomfort with female church leadership. For us, Phoebe has become a footnote. Yet, Paul places Phoebe at the forefront. Keeping with the tradition of ancient letter writing, Paul acknowledged the letter carrier at the end of the letter. Hear Paul's words again to the house churches in Rome. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church of Cenchreae, so that you might welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. Using only one sentence packed with significance, Paul introduces Phoebe. First, Paul commends Phoebe to the churches in Rome. Ancient letters commended the person carrying them, designating the bearer of the letter a trustworthy representative of the author. In each of his letters, Paul mentions the carrier of the letter and asks the church to take care of them. Just as Paul mentioned the males as brothers, he introduces Phoebe, our sister. Carriers of ancient letters not only delivered the letter, but read aloud or even performed the letter. Phoebe would have read, delivered, performed, interpreted the letter of Romans to the 5 house churches there. She likely had this long letter memorized, having rehearsed and studied it so she could present it as if she were Paul. Paul also introduces Phoebe as a deacon, a minister, and a leader in her church. Having never personally visited Rome himself, Paul chose Phoebe to be his first impression, asking the Roman churches to welcome her as if she were him. Paul shows Phoebe has credentials, informing the churches she is not only a church leader, but also a benefactor or patron of many, including of Paul himself. This description tells us Phoebe had wealth, property, and used her social influence for civic and religious causes. In ancient times, patrons had clients for whom they cared for and looked after. Patrons were champions for the vulnerable, protected people who did not have civil rights, and provided funds and resources for travelers. A few weeks ago, Reverend Graves preached on the women leaders listed in the Romans chapter 16. And it's a long list, making it clear to us that women's leadership in the house churches of Rome was obvious. Phoebe's voice would have been a common sound. Yet at some point along the way, the church stopped shining the spotlight on Phoebe. Little girls like me, growing up in evangelical spaces, experienced Paul as chief member of the He-Man Woman Haters Club. Positions against women in ministry tended to pluck individual verses from Paul's letters and present them as the picture of early Christianity. Many Christians are unaware of Paul's acknowledgement and respect for women's leadership in the church. Perhaps the church has stopped short of reading to Romans 16. Paul chose his most prized letter, his masterpiece, to be encountered through the body and voice of Phoebe. The fact that we let her fade into the background of our Bibles says more about us than it says about Paul. The same could be said about the Army Troop 6888, named the 6888. The women of the 6888 made up the only Black troop of the Women's Army Corps stationed in Europe during World War II. Two women, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, a civil rights activist, advocated for the inclusion of this African-American troop to support the war effort. In February of 1945, 850 members of the 6888 arrived in Birmingham, England. Exhausted by a long journey by ship and train, they were assigned to clear a backlog of mail and organize the postal system. For 2 years, American soldiers and their families back home had not been able to communicate due to the mail system's backlog. In that time, over 17 million pieces of mail had sat stacked floor to ceiling. Today, it's hard to imagine a time without emails, text, and the ability to FaceTime our loved ones. Yet back then, without letters, their form of communication, morale on the battlefield was low. Working in horrible, rat-infested conditions, the women quickly organized and got to work. They began by creating 3 8-hour shifts so they could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on this enormous project. Their slogan, "No mail, low morale." The women quickly encountered obstacles to mail delivery. Many letters were addressed to just Junior, and thousands upon thousands of letters addressed to common names like Robert Smith. The women had to create an intricate tracking system with 7 million info cards with serial numbers to identify each soldier. Using their tracking system, the women of the 6888 deciphered the codes in order to get the right letters to the correct soldiers. The women were able to sort 65,000 pieces of mail per shift, breaking all Army records. Given an assignment to complete this task in 6 months, the women of the 6888 completed it in just 90 days. In 1946, when the women of the 6888 returned home to the U.S., there was no celebration. They were given discharge papers and sent home with no recognition. The 6888 had returned home to the same racist nation they had left, leaving one battle to join another, the civil rights movement. In 1947, a year after this, when President Truman desegregated the Army, the records of Black units were destroyed, making it impossible for historians to know, let alone tell their story. So the contribution of the women of the 6888, what they had made to the war effort, was largely invisible in U.S. history until 2009, when they were recognized at Arlington National Cemetery at a women's history event. It was 10 years after that moment, in 2018, that the first and only monument was installed to commemorate their service and tell their story at Fort Leavenworth, just outside of Kansas City. And in 2022, Congress voted to award the 6888 the Congressional Gold Medal. Just this last fall, a movie on Netflix was released in their honor. Many of these women did not live to see their story told and their service recognized. As of last year, only a couple of the women of the 6888 were still living when the Netflix movie was released. One of these women, Lena Darricott King, was in hospice as she watched Tyler Perry's movie about her role in the Army. From her hospital bed, hair done, red lipstick on, she spoke on FaceTime to the female actors from the movie, thanking them for telling their story. Here's what she said. "I feel so honored that Tyler has chosen such beautiful women, such talented women to portray us. We just thought we were going over there to do a little job, and here we are, 75, 80 years later, being honored in such a way. It brings tears to my eyes because we thought no one even remembered us." Not long after thanking them for shining a light on their story, Lena passed away at the age of 101. Women's leadership and influence was recognized in the early church movement. The first people to hear the letter of Romans heard it in the voice of Phoebe. Paul chose a woman to embody his letter, meaning the face of Paul was experienced as the face of Phoebe. And when Christians in Rome could not understand the theologically thick letter, Phoebe sorted it out for them. So if Phoebe performed Romans for us today, what might she say? How might she sort out the letter? What was its message? Who was it for? Author Scott McKnight describes the city of Rome receiving the letter this way. Rome was a jumble of homes with twisting, turning paths on which one saw immigrants inquiring for residence, merchants finding a sale, wealthy searching for even more status, intellectuals finding a conversation, and politicians plotting power that privilege provided. The setting sounds familiar. Empire is connected to power, prestige, and status. Roman Christians living in the culture of the Roman Empire were divided, largely along ethnic lines, Jews and Gentiles. The way of the empire was influencing the relationships among the house churches, making it hard for Roman Christians to live together in peace and unity as siblings in Christ. When he was asked to sum up the letter in a sentence, McKnight says, "Welcome one another to the table as siblings." Paul, a Jew, demonstrates this by asking the church to welcome Phoebe, a Gentile, our sister. Paul's letter challenged Roman Christians not to erase their diversity, but to embrace it. McKnight says the issue at the heart of the letter is the inability of the privileged and the powerful to embody the gospel's inclusive demand and include the disprivileged and disempowered. Perhaps this is why Paul thought Phoebe best fit to deliver this particular letter. Within her very being, Phoebe lived out Paul's message. As a patron, Phoebe used her position and power to pick people up. If you're like me and have been following along with what's going on in our country, even just a little bit, you might have noticed the growing number of vulnerable people desperate right now to be seen. People who long for us to see diversity as beauty, to see immigrants and refugees as human beings, to see those in the trans community as athletes and soldiers, to see federal employees as hardworking civil servants, to see the poor and hungry around the world not as waste, but as wonders of God to behold. As Martin Luther King Jr. urged in his letter from Birmingham jail, I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. Phoebe's name is Greek, meaning bright or shining. Now that we have seen her today, it will be hard for us to look away.